Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have James Lee Ramsey. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. So you basically run and own that, and I can't even remember the name of the Facebook group now because you change it every bloody week.
Yeah, it's funny because it started off as strength and conditioning for combat athletes, and then I was like, okay, let's add nutrition, and then your wife started posting about sports psychology, and I'm like, it was strength conditioning, nutrition, injury prevention. Then I was like, okay, we need to have the sports psychology because it's such an important factor. So I was like, okay,
Yeah.
sports performance education for combat athletes, and that we're leaving it.
All right. So if you go onto Facebook, guys, and you search that, you'll find the Facebook group. But for people who aren't aware of maybe what you've been up to, some of your PhD research and your background, you want to give them a brief overview?
Yeah. Right now, I'm a PhD candidate. I'm on my fourth year at the University of Western Ontario. I'm looking at breath hold research. So it's a follow-up of a 2018 study that my lab did. Repeated cycles of 5-second breath holds during high-intensity exercise performed every 25 seconds. So the original study looked at general population. So that was a good starting.
Oh, hang on, James. I think we lost your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, then I got you now. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so what was the last thing you heard?
About the breath hold training.
Yeah, so the lab had a publication in 2018 looking at breath holds 5 seconds in duration during high-intensity exercise. But it was recreationally active participants. So I'm doing 3 studies where I'm going to compare, I'm looking at recreationally active, highly trained swimmers, and people who lift weights frequently. So the whole rationale is why we're looking at this breath hold is the homeostatic perturbations. So it's a stress. So the prevalent theory is if there is a stress on the body, then the body has to adapt. So that's why we're looking at this. Of course, there's not a lot of research on the VO2 kinetics and the near infrared spectroscopy of people while they're lifting weights. So I'm currently doing some pilot research on people who frequently lift weights right now, not recreationally trained. So actually might get a couple of publications off of that as well.
Nice. And then your background, you've coached quite a few fighters as well?
Yeah, so I UFC started in 1993. I was always into boxing and kickboxing. My dad's half-brother, Vernon Bell, trained U.S. Army Rangers. So he was a Ranger, and, I have other relatives that were Rangers and stuff like that. So a big martial arts family. A lot of people, everyone on my dad's side trained martial arts. Everyone on my mom's side is a doctor or an engineer. And I gravitated towards the martial arts, top martial arts. I trained since I was 5. I got down to Florida. And then I met up with, I was actually in the early MMA days down in Florida. So Bobby Hughes, he's on my friends list. He's a current Hapsamura third-degree black belt, which was ironic because that's like one of my favorite instructors. I got his DVDs. So he's teaching for him now. So it was me, him, and the late James Dorson. This was like 1996. We started training together when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started to get popular. We had a lot of crazy stories from those early MMA days because back in those days it was style versus style.
Yeah.
And Bob Hughes, who was, I think at the time he was already like a 6th-degree black belt in Oshikai Karate. He was like, listen, James, you don't just train one style. Don't just be a grappler, be a striker, I already was that. So actually, Bob Hughes down in Florida was the original MMA guy. I think he was the first guy that I knew that was cross-training. So,
damn, that's a mean experience to have. Just at the beginning of the UFC taking off.
Yeah, and then I moved up to Michigan, Bay City, Michigan, and I think it was like 2003, 2004, somewhere. You get old like me, everything starts to blend. And I ended up at former IBF World Boxing Champion Murray Sutherland's gym. I walked in the door there, started talking to him, and talked to some other people there. We opened up an MMA gym, and Unfortunately, the strength and the technique, the striking, the grappling was great. We had former USCOC, United States Olympic Training Center, Greco coach Steve Goss, who wrestled for 2 bronze medals. So we had some really high level guys to train with. But unfortunately, the strength and conditioning was terrible. We were doing CrossFit, like intense CrossFit. The whole mentality, the mentality was like, oh yeah, train. You know how the early CrossFit was. Train to you puke.
Yeah.
Our warm up is your workout, and we ended up ruining some people's careers. Like one of my Bellator fighters, his knee blew out. His knee gave out in the first round, and he won his first Bellator fight. His second Bellator fight, his knee came apart. In the first round, overtraining. The volume was insane. We would do like they call them the WODs, the workouts. Yeah, and then that's why I decided on a master's of exercise physiology, which my undergrad degree was criminology. I had very little science.
I was going to say, that's a big jump.
Yeah, I accidentally got admitted, and then I finished my master's with a 4.0, and that's how I got into a PhD in Canada. So, but yeah, I think a problem with a lot of coaches, this mentality is, train till you puke, train till you puke, and they stop training like 2 or 3 days before a fight. They don't do a taper, or deloads or anything like that. And I can't remember what coach said it. It's like, this expression really stuck with me. You want to stimulate, you don't want to obliterate.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I created the group. It's like I was on Facebook. I was reading all these posts. These people are like, oh, yeah, I'm jogging 6 to 8 miles a day. And, then I'm doing my CrossFit midday. And then all this other stuff. And, eating pizza and drinking beers. I was like, oh, God, I got to create a Facebook group. And here we are. Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone's interested into diving more into the old CrossFit MMA debate, if you just search CrossFit for MMA on Google, you'll find my article breaking that down. But I want to start with some of your research on the bilateral versus unilateral debates. Obviously, for anyone listening, bilateral, essentially 2 legs, unilateral, 1 leg exercises. So like your back squat versus your Bulgarian split squats. Do you want to maybe dive into some of that?
Yeah, it's funny because after CrossFit, I started listening to Michael Boyle, and he's like, only unilateral squat, squat. Everyone's stronger with 1 leg at a time compared to 2.
Never back squat.
Never back squat. And I was like, okay, so that was for my master's degree. I did all the coursework, and then I did a thesis that way I can get into a PhD program, and so I had 30 participants. It was 15 Division I athletes, and those 15, 15 recreationally trained. My supervisor hasn't published it yet, but there's been a lot going on, with COVID and everything like that. And so we did the leg press exercise because it was a lot, easier. So 2 legs at a time versus 1 leg at a time. And we also added the dumbbell shoulder press, 1 arm at a time and 2 that way we had an upper body and a lower body. And I was expecting, oh yeah, everyone's going to be stronger with 1 limb at a time. And looking back, I wish I created a survey. Like I should have asked them, how do you train? Do you train with 1 limb at a time or 2, so on and so forth? But I didn't do any of that. And I was expecting, oh yeah, everyone's stronger with 1 leg at a time. And that wasn't the case at all. And I asked everybody one question, I was like, do you squat with 1 leg at a time? They're like, no. And I think one person displayed a bilateral deficit. Everyone else displayed a bilateral facilitation, the opposite. And, and I was blown away, and at the time I was still training fighters. So I had 10 of them, and I did my own little experiment. Okay, we're going to do some bilateral training. do performance testing, do a washout period, and then do unilateral and stuff like that. And thankfully, at the same time, others started doing research with high-level athletes, showing that if you train with one limb at a time, you're stronger that way. If you train with two, you're stronger that way. And also, there's that. I haven't kept up with the literature because I got to read so much for my own material. That with change of direction, squatting bilaterally, they improved their change of direction much greater compared to the unilateral group. So I think you need both. You need bilateral, you need unilateral, but this whole notion of only train with one limb at a time, I don't know any elite coaches that are doing that.
Yeah, it's a bit reductionist. But when you mention just athletes are maybe stronger unilateral or bilateral, you mean they're able to handle more than 50% of their bilateral load on one leg? Or are we talking absolute load?
It's kind of like when we were doing pilot testing, one of my participants at EMU was a former Division I football player. And with one leg at a time, full range of motion, he had some back issues. And I think with one leg at a time, it was the one participant. He got 750, and he got 750. So it added up to 1,500 pounds. So he displayed a little deficit. But with both legs at a time, he can only leg press 1,000 pounds. So there's a big difference. Yeah. But there was, we had a hockey player, a high-level hockey player, and it was the complete opposite. I can't remember what the totals were. But, I have read that the magnitude of the bilateral deficit is greater for the lower body compared to the upper body. Why? I don't think anyone knows, and I haven't really followed the research on that.
Gotcha. So with a combat athlete, where would you see bilateral or unilateral exercise fitting within, say, a preparation for a fight? For example, off camp to in camp, do you think there's like a ratio that needs to be done, or transitioning from one to the other, or is it just kind of like, hey, we just train both all the way through?
I'd like to see some studies on that, but I think I kind of like the Chaldea's approach. You start off bilateral, have them train bilaterally, and then you peak them unilaterally. I do that with, I would do that for the lower body and the upper body. There's no research, no one's done any studies, but it would definitely be interesting to see what the data is. Or maybe it's better to use a combination of the two. Unfortunately, the literature is lacking on that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's difficult as well, as you mentioned, like you talked about potentially doing a survey beforehand, how they usually train. With a lot of these studies, often the training intervention is such a novel stimulus that of course you're going to see gains because it's so different to how they're already training, So there's always a trade-off.
Oh, that's why. I learned from my first study. So, so we're doing some, with the trap bar, deadlift, lower body exercise. We're looking, with the Cosmet, breath by breath, looking at VO2, VCO2 ventilation, the end tidal O2, so end tidal partial pressures, and with the near infrared spectroscopy, that tells us, the muscle saturation, desaturation, so on. There's all these different measures. Take all day to explain, but for the participants, we are doing a detailed training history, like how do you train, and it's like looking back, hindsight's always 20/20. I should have done a survey, but I was so. It's important not to get locked into a mentality. This is the way. This is the way. This is the way. I thought, oh yeah, everyone's stronger with one leg at a time because Michael Boyle said so.
Yeah, for sure. I actually wanted to dive a little bit into your PhD stuff. So you mentioned about the breath hold training at the beginning, and I know your PhD was an oxygen kinetics. You want to maybe explain what that actually is, and then maybe dive into some of the breath hold stuff, why you do it. I think most people's maybe exposure to it is maybe through seeing like Wim Hof, even some of the UFC countdown kind of thing, like Israel Adesanya, you see doing stuff in the pool. I was just at the UFC PI last week, and they have their underwater treadmill that they also use for breath hold training. So it seems to be a little more mainstream now.
I didn't even know. I didn't even know.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny because people always ask me about, oh yeah, what about this guy that wrote a book on breath holds? I don't know. I haven't read it, and I'm not buying it. You know. So there's people confuse VO2 max and VO2 kinetics. They think it's the same thing. So VO2 max is the maximal capacity, I'm just going to use layman terms, for your body to deliver and utilize oxygen. In contrast, VO2 kinetics, it's the dynamic VO2 response to the onset and offset of exercise. So if I draw a little curve, like I should have pulled up a figure. You can pull up a figure. So there's a little. So highly trained endurance athletes, right? Their VO2 will shoot up. Okay.
Yeah.
In contrast, recreationally, the curve is much more flatter. And we describe it with a number called tau, the time constant, which it's the time it takes to get to 63% of the amplitude or the height. Mm-hmm. Now, so for a recreationally trained person, their VO2 kinetics will be 25 seconds. And they'll reach steady state in about 2 to 3 minutes, right? In contrast, if you look at some of these world-class endurance athletes, their VO2 kinetics is only 10 seconds. And they can reach steady state in about 30 seconds rather than 2 to 3 minutes. So, I mean, if you want a technical definition, a really good one I saw, it's the rate of adjustment of O2 delivery and utilization within the microvasculature during the transition from rest to exercise. But it's how quickly things turn on. So it's the dynamic VO2 response to the onset of exercise and the dynamic VO2 response at the offset of exercise. So that's the difference. Now, why breath hold training? Well, as I alluded to earlier, anytime the body is stressed, you think back to Cilia's general adaptation syndrome. Whenever there's a stress, the body responds and there's an adaptation. I think I posted about this in the group. A lot of people are like, why do you want to do high intensity stuff? It doesn't even have to be breath hold training. Why high intensity as opposed to long, slow distance runs? And Jamnik 2020, if you look up the publication, there's a reference in there that talks about what I just mentioned, and that it looks like mitochondrial biogenesis, right? So the more mitochondria content you have within the muscle, the more aerobic you are, greater, to extract and utilize that oxygen to produce energy. So it looks like lactate from anaerobic glycolysis is the main signal to generate, increases in mitochondrial content. And of course, other things such as carbonic acid, it's like during high intensity, CO2 will combine with water, form carbonic acid. We'll leave it at that. I'll spare all the biochemistry. But research found if you inhibit those carbonic acids, you'll get very little mitochondrial content. So it's all these stresses occurring, that during high intensity. It's like ventilation. It's like the amount of CO2 that you in moderate intensity exercise, to clear 1 liter of CO2 that's being produced in your body, it takes like 20 liters of oxygen, to clear that. The principal reason why you're huffing and puffing is to blow off that CO2, because we got to keep that blood pH on the arterial, 7.45, and the venous 7.35. We want to keep that at, homeostatic levels, but during high intensity, it can take like 29 liters of ventilation to clear 1 liter of CO2, so is what it all comes down to. If you're stressing the body, there's that signal, the body's like, oh crap, we got to adapt.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's maybe dive into maybe some of the application then as well. So how would you do breath hold training And what are you trying to get out of it? So you mentioned you're trying to stress the body. Is the response you're trying to get that faster VO2 kinetic, essentially that graph to be steeper?
Well, we to increase mitochondrial content as much as possible.
Okay.
I mean, I believe, the VO2 maxes of MMA fighters, I've only looked at one publication. They're like 55. Last time I checked. I mean, you want to...
the UFC released their one. I can't remember off the top of my head. They did it by weight class, so it ranged from like 40 something up to like high 50s or low 60s, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, VO2 or aerobic is important for the recovery. So an MMA fight, it's not constant. So you run and you throw a combination, and you recover. You're regenerating PCR. There's I believe it was Kramer. I can't remember the research off the top of my head. But, I mean, going back to, like, 2007, they found that those, and it was during resistance training, those with higher VO2s, they recovered. They had a better recovery in between sets. Well, same thing with those little bursts of explosive activities. That's what we're regenerating, the PCR.
Yeah. So how are you using breath hold training to do that then? Do you have a specific protocol you use?
Cal Diaz has a really good one with the contralateral dumbbells. And I really like that study. Actually, I sent you that video of me doing breath hold sprints. That was from a study in 2018 where they had elite level rugby players. But with that,
I think that was the Aussie team, wasn't it? I think that was the Aussie. I remember they had mouth tape on one point when they were doing sand dunes, and they had their mouth tape on. I don't know if it was just Australia that did it, but it made its way into the rugby world for sure.
Yeah. I mean, these were high-level athletes. These weren't general population. So they had two groups. They had, breath hold and those that did regular sprints. And repeat sprint ability, was significantly greater for those that did breath hold compared to those that didn't do breath hold. Now, but then again, obviously this is going to work great for field athletes, field-based athletes such as rugby players, soccer players, football players, so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure where it should fit. I mean, does this correlate? I mean, is this going to help MMA fighters? I kind of view it as, general prep. Like instead of specific prep, that's probably where I would throw it in because we don't know. I mean, obviously you don't want to do breath hold while you're hitting the bag, MMA training. But like where to plug it into the periodization program. My best guess right now would be general prep to boost that aerobic base as much as possible. And then once you get to specific prep, whatever you want to call the phase, as you're getting ready for competition, just focus more on sparring. It's just there's so many questions that need to be answered. I mean, obviously, it worked for world-class rugby players. Actually, how's the UFC doing it? Where are they plugging it?
I'm not too sure. I just know they have the underwater treadmill, so they must do it underwater.
Huh.
I don't know if they do it with exercise or not. But do you want to maybe, if there's a fighter, amateur fighter listening to this, do you want to give like maybe an example of exactly how you would implement breath hold? For example, what kind of mode of conditioning, and then how long hold your breath, etc.
Yeah. But back to that UFC with the underwater. I think I know why they're doing it underwater. Do you know what the water temperature was?
Oh, I don't know that one.
Because the diving response. All right, so the diving response is just a fancy term for all the physiological adjustments that occur, while you're, breath hold, redistribution of blood flow, so on and so forth. But I know it's more pronounced, with facial immersion. Like if you have someone in a lab and you stick their face in a bucket of cold water, so it's more pronounced. So that's pretty interesting. But how amateur fighters would do it, I mean, myself, I've used it quite a bit, is like the Cal Diaz version. You just get a light dumbbell, 25-pound dumbbell, do a reverse shrug, a reverse lunge with a press. And like every third set, I believe it is, you try to hold your breath as long as possible. You could probably get a pulse oximeter too to see, if your saturation is decreasing, but you don't need anything fancy. Just some dumbbells, the circuits, 20 seconds on, 15 seconds off, a press, a lunge, a one-legged deadlift, a row, while holding your breath as long as possible during the set every 3 seconds or every third set. I believe that is the program.
Okay.
You don't need anything fancy, but as of right now, in my mind, I think it's best in the general preparation phase. And as you get closer to the fight, I think you want to focus more on sparring, so on and so forth. But there's so many questions that haven't been answered yet.
Yeah. So if anyone's interested in that circuit, if you just search contralateral dumbbell circuit on Google, you should find Cal. It's free from Cal. It's on there. He's got a whole circuit laid out with all those exercises. So essentially every third set then you're holding your breath. And the idea is that by holding your breath, you're going to increase the intensity of the exercise, and therefore you're going to increase creation of new mitochondria and develop that aerobic energy system. Is that right?
Yeah, increasing lactate. Actually, it's interesting. The higher your lactate, lactate is an important stimulus for testosterone, which we all know how important.
Interesting.
Yeah, testosterone for males and growth hormone also. I remember from my doctoral comprehensive exams in 2020, it's interesting. Testosterone is more important for males, while growth hormone is more important for female athletes.
Interesting. In what sense or what context is that?
For hypertrophy, that's from Kramer, 2005. He's got a really nice. Actually, I should post that in the group tomorrow. Yeah. There's so many. That's an important paper. With the hormones and stuff like that, like how many sets of squats you need to elicit a hormonal response. It's like after the fourth set, the testosterone. It's a pretty.
That's right. Yeah, I've got his ResearchGate on my phone, so I wanted to look through that because I know recently as well, like the acute hormonal response doesn't lead to long-term gains. Like the acute hormonal response from training is like whatever. So I wanted to kind of go back and have a look through and just kind of see what they were coming up with there, then kind of look at it now. So it's interesting kind of how it's progressed, how a lot of training used to be focused around that acute hormonal response, like, doing this is what's going to increase your testosterone straight after, so it must lead to better gains, but, not so sure now.
Yeah. It's not what I specialize in. It's just you always hear with the testosterone replacement therapy. The old Vitor Belfort. Remember those days on TRT? Nothing. The scariest animal on this planet was Vitor Belfort on TRT.
Well, he's back home for sure. You saw him in his last boxing match.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he couldn't beat WADA, I'll tell you that.
No, for sure. I wanted to dive more into the idea of this high intensity or lactate to essentially create new mitochondria. So a couple of episodes ago, I had Tim Kittenring on. We dove into a little bit of the aerobic side of mitochondrial, biogenesis or creating new mitochondria. We talked a lot about low intensity aerobic work as well. So do you see low intensity aerobic training fitting within this kind of paradigm of training? So I know you mentioned obviously high intensity being important for that increasing lactate. Is that necessary? Do you always need to do that? Do you think you can almost omit low intensity aerobic work?
No, you can't train at high intensities all the time. Like early. That's why I like the breath hold training early in a general preparation phase, because it's not, you are increasing the lactate, but it's not really high intensity, but how and where that fits in. Of course, you got to take time off from training too. It's like after a fight camp, take a week off, go for a walk, just go for long walks. But everyone recovers differently. It's like taper and deload. There's a lot of individual, variability. because most people adapt, their tolerance for stress. Some people may need more sets than others. But I think another problem is, people confuse, that's why I created the group, people confuse, training for performance, with bodybuilding. It's like bodybuilding. You know what I'm saying? We're not doing legs, push, pull, 10 sets of 10. We're not doing German volume. It's stimulate, not obliterate, and training for hypertrophy lays the foundation for the development of strength, and strength lays the foundation for the development of power. But you know what I'm saying? You're not trying to get them biceps huge, doing a bunch of curls and
No, exactly. I mean, I harp on that a lot in terms of people doing pure bodybuilding or powerlifting programs.
Yeah,
there's some principles that carry over for maybe certain set and rep protocols or certain protocols you do. But if you run a pure powerlifting program, you're going to be absolutely fucked when it comes to your technical training.
And I don't. And why do they call it powerlifting?
Weightlifting should be powerlifting technically.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. It's like power is force times velocity. There's that explosive thing. It's like when I 1 rep max on my barbell. It's like it's not. There's no velocity component. It's like the perfect example is like a power clean. You got to. The contraction, and I think that's you need a hypertrophy phase. You may or may not, and it's like there's so many things to consider with designing a training program. It's like is it linear? Is it nonlinear? Is it daily undulating periodization? I think DUP is best for people that they don't know when they have a fight coming. I remember reading that in some of the publications and recommending it. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you have, if someone has a fight camp 3 months out, supposedly you can design a really good, the ideal, we're doing this, assuming there's no injuries, so on and so forth, overtraining.
Yeah.
I think there's always going to be overtraining in MMA because that's how it works, but you're just trying to minimize that as much as possible.
Yeah, you got so many things you need to cover, obviously your grappling, or your various grappling, because you've obviously got jiu-jitsu on the ground, you've got wrestling against the fence, you've got wrestling, then you've got clinch, and then you've got every other striking art around that, and then blending it all together. So obviously it's finding that balance for people. Yeah, it's within that.
It's that, I think through drilling, you're getting plenty of they're getting a ton of moderate intensity work. So that's why I push the high intensity, but how much, what's the ideal, how much high intensity, do they need more than 2 sessions a week if they're sparring and they're grappling hard? But back to what we were doing, it's like, actually the only YouTube video I have of myself doing something, it's 47 tire flips in 5 minutes. I had a 300-pound tire. I flipped it like 47 times in like 5 minutes. That's what I would do before I would wrestle. What? Yeah, it's like we would do all this like stupid stuff. It's like I go back in time and I think about how we used to train. All right, we're gonna do 100 squats, 100 barbell squats. We're gonna do 100 pull-ups. Then we're gonna go flip a tire. And and that's, we ruined athletes' careers. A lack of knowledge is dangerous.
Well, it's still happening now, so it's not exclusive to just you and your group.
I know. I'm on Facebook all the time, and I'm reading stuff. It's like, should I say something? Should I not say something? At least a good thing we got, we got Andrew Usher in the group. He's doing research on the physiology with all those world champion boxers. And like Dr. Tremblay.
I think let's get him on the podcast then.
Yeah, got to get him. And Dr. Tremblay, he says, I got 7 world champions at my gym, and we stopped the road work. We started doing high intensity, and every one of them, their sports performance improved.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to get your take on that. So, for me, sure, if you enjoy some running, do it, but I think there's other ways of doing that low intensity work that could be, depending on your boxing load. For example, you could be doing shadow boxing, etc., etc. but I'm not so sure I'm sold on fully removing the low intensity aspect. Now, I don't know what the rest of the training program looks like, so I can't say, oh, blah, blah, blah. So I want to know, what's your take on that? So would you then completely, I mean, I asked you this before in terms of low intensity stuff, but does that mean you would completely remove all low intensity work, leave the low intensity work to the boxing training, and only supplement with the high intensity stuff?
I mean, you're going to get plenty of low intensity training. Like how I like to warm up was pummeling. We did a lot of pummeling. Warm up. Obviously you don't go at it. You got to warm up before you start training hard. But like that 5 minutes of low intense, or whatever the duration is, I'd rather do it with pummeling. Or so I'm biased on the pummeling thing because we had a Greco guy who wrestled for 2 bronze medals. So, it's like if you're going to do low intensity, at least, in my mind, why go running when you can, refine your pummeling? That's just one example. Yeah. Or maybe some shadow box and light, easy sprawl, shadow box, sprawl, or whatever, specific to that combat sport. There's so many that need answers, but it was interesting. I remember I posted that study in the group, and it was like for low intensity or moderate intensity training, instead of doing 30 minutes of continuous cycling, they had participants, like 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 1 minute on, 1 minute off. So they got that 30 minutes of work. Yeah, the workout took 60 minutes rather than 30 minutes. But their AMPK, or the signaling to increase mitochondrial content, was significantly greater in that intermittent group. Why no one has done any studies on that, as of yet, I have no idea. I'd like to see that done. Like I said, there are
that's interesting
that we need answers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could ask a million questions of that study. What were they doing beforehand in terms of training? Was that a new stimulus? What would you do after a cycle of that? Because you can't just do 1 minute on, 1 minute off for 60 minutes. And then what do you do the following weeks, to progress? You go to 90 minutes of it?
It's like, is that the optimal? Is 1 minute on, 1 minute off?
Yeah.
Is that the optimal, I mean, it's an interesting, it demonstrates intermittent versus continuous exercise. So it's an interesting thought. Actually, that's what my PhD supervisor did for his thesis at the University of Toronto, was continuous versus intermittent exercise. I'll post about that.
Interesting. Yeah, for sure. Do you have a quick breakdown of that, of any of the findings?
He replicated a study from the 1960s where they did 10 seconds on, 5 seconds off. So, and I'll just jump to the third study for the sake of time, because it was a training study.
Yeah.
And found significant greater adaptations with the 10 seconds on, 5 seconds off compared to the continuous at high intensity. So that was pretty interesting.
Interesting. Well, what about if you're doing high intensity work? Obviously, it depends how high intensity and how much of you're doing. Obviously, when you're getting towards a lot of anaerobic lactic energy system input, you're almost diminishing a lot of the aerobic adaptations there. It's almost like that trade-off, right? It's like a seesaw you're trying to balance.
Yeah.
So then how would you then balance, I guess, doing that high intensity work? I guess you wouldn't want to completely get rid of some of the low intensity steady state stuff, or maybe the low intensity interval stuff.
You need both. Different training days. I remember, the one coach that comes to mind was Caldeo's talking about have them do these, different intensities on different days. But what's the optimal method? I don't know. But it all comes down to the individual. It all comes down to the individual athletes. You have them athletes that have explosive power that gas out real easy. Then you have those guys that could go run 8 miles, and barely break a sweat who don't have power. I mean, there's a lot of everything has to be tailored to the individual athlete. That's why you have to do performance testing early on. But Like what it comes down to is it's like for MMA, it's your ability, to produce repeated explosive power move, that power endurance.
Yeah.
But what's the optimal way to improve that?
Yeah. I mean, if anyone wants a quick stat from the UFC themselves, 77% of fights are finished in the 8 to 14 second high intensity exercise window. So essentially, you need to be able to produce a lot of power and repeat it, because that's where most of the fights are finished.
Yeah. It's like if you don't have power, it's like I remember people arguing in the group. I didn't expect the group to get to 14,000. It's like when I created, I thought it'd just be a couple hundred people. We'd be talking. I do this, I do that. But I remember early on, people were like, "Well, look at the Diaz brothers. Look at the Diaz brothers. They do
the triathletes."
And it's like, yeah. It's kind of like, you can't. If you want to be a triathlete, train that. If you want to be able, but that's going to diminish, your repeated, explosive, your ability to, produce repeated explosive contractions.
Yeah. You need to remember as well that they're real volume like their game is just volume.
I know.
It's work rate.
Yeah, so they'll pepper you with a couple hundred punches, and you're like, yeah, I know. But then again, I don't think they've been doing so great the last couple times I saw them fight.
Yeah,
so,
for sure. I actually wanted to dive back a little bit into the oxygen kinetic stuff. You mentioned well-trained athletes have that steep curve and they reach that steady state in around 30 seconds, untrained like 2-3 minutes. What's the benefit of being able to reach that, I guess, that steady state sooner versus someone who doesn't?
The benefit, less reliance on the anaerobic sources early on that you have to replenish. Actually, a real interesting thing that I want to look at after I graduate is priming exercise. Because in our lab, we had a legendary researcher who retired, Dr. Kowalczyk. They did some priming exercise, where they did high intensity exercise, then they rest a period, and then they did moderate intensity exercise, to improve performance. It worked for old people, older participants compared to younger. That's another issue that needs to be addressed in MMA. What's the optimal, warm up, priming the body? Like all these studies, the previous priming exercise studies, at least all the ones I've seen, have been on, older participants and recreationally trained. And obviously, that's not really applicable, to high-level athletes.
Yeah. There's quite a few in rugby and team sports and things. So I've done a huge deep dive. I've done a course on it for Science for Sport and things. So there's like, are you talking about going like almost like a post-activation potentiation where you're doing like a warm-up thing going straight into, I guess, training?
No,
or are you looking at a day later?
No, like 6 to 10 minutes. It's kind of like Pat Smith. I got his wrestling DVDs. He was a 4-time Division I national champion at Oklahoma State. His brother won 2 gold medals. And he always talked about, and this stuck with me, I need to find that. I need to screen capture that video and share it to the group. He's like, I like to warm up really hard. I like to do a hard match, a 2-3 minute match, 30 minutes before I do my first match, because I found that I did much better. You always do terrible on the first, and then once you wake the body up and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I need to share, so like with fighters, what's the optimal warm up? Should they warm up high intensity? Should they warm up moderate intensity? That's another topic, because I was watching that, and then I was talking to a couple other guys who used to wrestle Division I, and they were telling me the same thing. They're like, "Oh yeah, I had to warm up hard 20 minutes before I stepped onto the mat. And that made all the difference in the world. You know, it's like,
So I think there's only one study that I've come across that looked at priming for endurance athletes. So most of the priming stuff's done on like power field sport athletes, where they're looking at, power cleans, bench press, whatever, and then seeing that priming effect maybe 6 to 33 hours or 6 to 48 hours later. Some of them use re-warm ups, so they'll warm up and then they'll do like a re-warm up after a break to improve performance on the field. But one in endurance, they used, I think it was in runners, they used leg extensions, but they did like in a 45-second, was it isometrics? They did some kind of endurance protocol on a leg extension to improve endurance performance, for that race, which was interesting. I haven't seen anything on it since or any other research down that road, but it could be something interesting whether it makes its way into some kind of combat sports or, some kind of warm-up area.
yeah, that reminds me, because I left Eastern Michigan University where I got my master's degree. Well, it was actually done in 2016, but I didn't get to defend my thesis till 2018. Long story, long complicated story. But there was actually an individual who did a master's thesis on isometric exercise. They had him do some kind of isometric exercise, and then they did sprints 10 minutes later, which you just reminded me about that because I got to go look up his thesis. Ouch.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff. Even on isometrics as well, a lot of good stuff on that, on the whole priming and I guess post-activation potential. So everyone's wondering what we're talking about, and specifically, it's like doing it a high intensity or heavy loaded exercise first, and then in 3 to 10 minutes time, you should see an improvement in power output or performance in whatever the activity is. And it's a well researched area, but it's some of the context is lacking in certain areas, as we mentioned with combat sports and warming up and things like that. What I find quite interesting is primers and for example, professional rugby have become like a mainstay. Like everyone kind of does it. Either if you play Saturday, you'll either do a primer, like a power primer Friday night, or you'll do one Saturday morning of game day. Now I was wondering if sports like MMA, where you have a 24 or 36 hour weigh-in, where you've got more time, if that would make its way into combat sports, where you do some kind of like power primer 12 to 40 or 24 hours out from a fight to see performance improvements there. But obviously you've got a weight cut to deal with too.
Yeah, Yas Parr in the group, he says that he has his boxers do a plyometric warm-up like 24 hours before the fight. So, because there's a lot of there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. It's not that strong, but it does provide ideas for research. But there was a ton of anecdotal evidence, with coaches, with plyometrics, the day before. And then I did come across a study where they found that plyometrics, it primed 24 to 48 hours. And I know Yas Parr is using a low volume, high intensity full body plyometric warm up for his fighters. But like I said, there's so many questions that need to be answered. That's why after I graduate and if I open up my own lab, I want to look at priming exercise, the high intensity, try different modalities of how to optimally warm up, for fighters, and do some sort of performance test. Because obviously you don't want to do experiments. It's like, okay, you got to fight. We're going to do a little experiment. It's like that wouldn't be a good idea.
For sure. There's actually one area. Yeah. No, you carry on. So I was going to say one area of research I've kind of thought about would be interesting, especially within MMA or even other combat sports, is obviously GPS and things are essentially a mainstay within sports like rugby and things. You're tracking movement on the field, K's done, whatever. Even some kind of indoor like accelerometer or GPS for example, MMA sparring, and then collecting that kind of data and seeing the actual like needs analysis of MMA, in terms of like movement, actions within a rounds, things like that. And you could potentially base almost worst case scenario trainings off of it, get an idea of what like an average or sparring session at least looks like to give some data back to the coaches. I think that would be interesting. I don't know anyone who's doing anything like that yet, if that's even feasible within a lot of clubs and things. But
Andrew was doing some research with his world champion boxers with the accelerometers and stuff like that. The problem is when they would throw a feint, they throw a feint.
It counts.
Yeah, it counts. So that's maybe some. Technology. It's like velocity-based training. I really like that idea. With the velocity-based training. But what's better, velocity-based training or rate of perceived exertion? With determining what kind of load to use, so on and so forth. I kind of like velocity-based training better myself because it's more objective. Other than rating and perceived exertion, because an MMA fighter's 8 might be someone else's, 10. That's the whole problem with that. Well, not the whole problem, but one of the major obstacles with professional fighters is overtraining because they're so used to misery. Miserable training conditions.
Well, the fight itself can be misery, so they want to kind of replicate that in training. Be like, if I do this, it's going to help this. But unfortunately, it's not quite how it works. You kind of need to train around either side of what you're doing in there to kind of bring it all together.
Yeah, it's like trying to determine what's the optimal when, where. There's so many questions that need to be answered. But that's interesting to know that I'm not the only one looking at breath hold physiology, that the UFC is doing it with underwater treadmills. I had no idea.
I'll link you up. I'll link you up and see, and you can see what they're up to and share what you're doing too. So I'm sure it'll be valuable for both of you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because same area, but trying to recruit participants for an underwater treadmill would be kind of harsh. Getting around ethics,
we're just drowning them. It's okay.
It's interesting because when you look at the older studies, they did that study where they told participants they were giving them anabolic steroids. It was like the 1960s, 70s, but they weren't giving. Did you do that study?
I haven't, no.
Okay, it was like the early 1970s. They told the participants, they had them do a baseline training, and then they randomly selected people. I'll post it in the group tomorrow. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to give you anabolic steroids. And instead of their strength increasing like this, it really increased. There were so many things that went on in early days of research. That's why we have the IRB. And it's like trying to get an underwater treadmill. I don't think that would fly.
Well, if you're in the old Soviet era, you could do what you want.
Oh, yeah. like the CRISP DNA. The CRISP.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure they're doing it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially through like Asia and China and stuff. They're doing some gene doping now.
Oh yeah, that stuff's going on. It's like that Russian, that 97 kg freestyle wrestler that nobody can beat. It's like, let's take a look at his genetic profile, see what's going on with that.
Yeah, I mean, doping it for like the layman or just maybe the general fan of sport. It's almost like it's hard for someone to comprehend how much doping is actually going on in all sports at the highest level. Like we see, obviously, because my wife competes in elite level weightlifting. Obviously, Olympic weightlifting along with track and field, has a huge history of doping. And you just get to a point where you can almost see the signs of someone doping, like in terms of like someone lifting similar weights to other people that have been popped before. You see the traps in the shoulders, separation. You see that little turtle gut. These little things that you see, and you're like, it's just, people are just better and better at hiding it than ever.
Yeah, it's like the whole breath hold. I'll post the study tomorrow in the group.
Yeah.
I got to post. Got to remind me. I'm getting old and senile. One research group found that, I believe, they called it low pulmonary ventilation. So they would exhale and then they would hold their breath. And they found that it worked out to about an elevation of 2,500 meters. I remember reading that. because I'm not doing blood work looking at the EPO hormone, stuff like that.
Yeah.
For those that don't know about EPO hormone, just Google TJ Dillashaw EPO. I mean, it's I thought that was, yeah. So, I mean, if you go to China,
I'm just going to say, if anyone's interested in doping in the UFC, if you just go onto the USADA website and go into the sanctions section, you will be gobsmacked at the number of fighters that have been popped recently and high-level fighters that you didn't even know about. And that is because obviously they only fight once or twice a year. When you take a 6-month ban, it's just your training. Your training camp between fights anyway.
Yeah, it's vacation. Oh, I know. It's like I've been around the block. I've been around, boxing and kickboxing and MMA since 1993. And, it's a lot more prevalent than what people think.
Yeah, definitely. Even though they say, well, I think the UFC, since they had new ownership, have kind of laxed some of the testing rules, but when
like
they were at least.
John Jones, when he got popped for the cocaine, the ratio of his testosterone to epitestosterone, it's like one of my professors when I was working on my master's, I told him about it. He started laughing. He's like, yeah, that's perfectly normal.
Yeah, exactly. No, all good. Well, I think we've covered a lot of the stuff, especially with the PhD as well. If there's anything you want to add to the conversation, you can feel free to do so. But if not, where can people find you to kind of follow what you're up to?
My Facebook group, Sports Performance Education for Combat Athletes. So
maybe I'll link that up in the description.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah, perfect. All good. Well, thanks for coming on, James. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.